What if a man could be both a brilliant soldier and a decent human being, while serving a cause the world would come to despise? He was the enemy his opponents respected, the general whose legend grew even in defeat. By the end of this journey, you will understand the paradox of the man they called the Desert Fox. His story doesn't begin on a grand estate or in a long line of famous generals. It starts in a quiet home in southern Germany, with a schoolmaster for a father and a civil servant for a mother. In the rigid German Empire of the late 19th century, the officer corps was a world reserved for the aristocracy, for families with military names stretching back for generations. Erwin Rommel had none of that. He was an outsider from his very first breath. His father, a man of books and discipline, had initially hoped his son would follow a more academic path. But young Erwin was drawn to something else. And so, in 1910, with his father's reluctant blessing, he joined the 124th Infantry Regiment, not as a nobleman, but as a simple officer cadet. He was sent to the officers' school in Danzig, a place where background and connections mattered. Yet Rommel had something else, an intense, restless energy, and a mind that saw the world differently. What turns a schoolteacher's son, a boy from an ordinary family, into a warrior whose name would echo through history? When the Great War erupted across Europe in 1914, Rommel was a young lieutenant. He was sent to the trenches of France, the mountains of Romania, and the rugged terrain of Italy. It was here, in the crucible of the first modern war, that the quiet cadet vanished, and a new kind of leader was born. He wasn't a general sitting miles behind the lines, moving pins on a map. He was at the very front, leading his men from the charge, sharing their risks and their fears. He believed in leading by example, a simple philosophy that would earn him unwavering loyalty for the rest of his life. His courage was almost reckless. He was wounded several times, yet always returned to the fight with a fierce determination. The old rigid rules of warfare seemed foolish to him. Why march in straight lines toward machine guns? Why sit in a trench waiting for the inevitable? Rommel saw that speed, surprise, and boldness could achieve what sheer numbers could not. This became his creed. This belief was put to the ultimate test in the mountains of Italy. In one now famous engagement, Rommel and a small force of just 150 men found themselves facing an Italian force of over 7,000. By all military logic, they should have surrendered or been annihilated. Instead, Rommel used the terrain, relentless movement, and sheer audacity to confuse and demoralize the larger army. In a stunning turn of events, he and his handful of men captured the entire enemy force. For this incredible feat, he was awarded Germany's highest military honor, the Pour le Mérite, or Blue Max. This mainstream historical fact cemented his status as a war hero. But was it just courage, or was it the first glimpse of a man who simply refused to play by the established rules? After the war, Germany was a nation in ruins, its army dismantled, its pride shattered. Most ambitious officers would have sought a position on the prestigious General Staff in Berlin, the heart of German military planning. Rommel was offered such a post, a clear path to power and influence. He turned it down. He chose instead to remain with the infantry, to become a teacher at military academies. He preferred the company of real soldiers to the politics of high command. It was during this time that he did something unusual for a soldier. He wrote a book, titled Infantry Attacks. It wasn't a dry academic textbook. It was a collection of his own battlefield experiences from World War I, written in a clear, practical style. It was filled with his core beliefs: lead from the front, move fast, and always maintain the element of surprise. This quirky tidbit is that his book became a bestseller in Germany, read by soldiers and civilians alike. It was even read by a rising political figure named Adolf Hitler, who was deeply impressed by Rommel's philosophy of aggressive, forward-moving warfare. The book made Rommel a quiet celebrity within the military, long before the world knew his name. As an instructor, he wasn't interested in parade ground perfection. He taught his students to think for themselves, to adapt, to be unpredictable. He would lead them on grueling marches through the mountains, teaching them to live off the land and to fight in any weather, day or night. He was shaping a new kind of soldier for a new kind of war, whether he knew it yet or not. But as he taught this new generation, did he ever pause to question the dark ideology that was beginning to rise in his country? The very ideology they would soon be fighting for. This brings us to an unresolved question that hangs over his life. Rommel was never a vocal member of the Nazi Party in its early days. His journals and letters show a man dedicated to his soldiers and to the honor of the German army, not to political rallies. Yet he, like many Germans, was captivated by the promise to restore Germany's strength and pride. He saw in Hitler a leader who was rebuilding the military he loved. The question remains, was his support born of patriotic duty, a soldier's loyalty to the state, or did he, in his ambition, choose to overlook the darkness gathering at the heart of the new regime? We may never truly know what was in his heart during those years, as he stood on the edge of destiny, a respected teacher about to be called to the world's deadliest stage. The theories Rommel had taught in the classroom were about to be tested by fire and steel. As Germany prepared to unleash a new kind of warfare on the world, a terrifying, lightning-fast assault they called blitzkrieg, Rommel was given a new command. It was a decision that sent ripples of shock through the German military elite. He was not given another infantry unit. Instead, he was handed control of the 7th Panzer Division. The old guard of the Panzer Corps, men who had spent their careers developing tank theory, were aghast. An infantryman, a mountain specialist, was to lead an armored spearhead into France? It felt like an insult to their expertise. But the appointment was a personal choice by Hitler, who saw in Rommel the embodiment of the aggressive, risk-taking spirit he wanted in his generals. In May of 1940, the storm broke. German forces stormed into France, but not through the heavily defended frontier. Instead, they did the unthinkable, punching through the dense, hilly Ardennes forest, a region the French High Command had considered impassable for a modern armored army. This was the master plan, and Rommel's 7th Panzer Division was at the very tip of the spear. What happened next was not just a military victory, it was a performance that left both his enemies and his allies breathless. While other commanders advanced methodically, cautiously securing their flanks and waiting for supply lines to catch up, Rommel simply went. He pushed his tanks and men forward day and night, barely stopping to rest. For the French soldiers in his path, it was a nightmare. One moment, the front was quiet. The next, a tide of steel was upon them, appearing from nowhere. Before a report could even reach headquarters, the headquarters itself was being overrun. The Germans weren't just breaking the line, they were dissolving the very structure of the army. Rommel believed that speed was its own form of security. If you moved fast enough, the enemy never had time to organize a defense, never had time to react, never even had time to fully understand what was happening. His division drove so deep, so quickly into French territory that it literally vanished from the maps back at German headquarters. This is the mainstream fact that gave his unit its famous name, the Ghost Division. For days, his own superiors had no idea where he was. They only knew he was somewhere deep behind enemy lines, sowing chaos and confusion. This legendary speed was not achieved from a comfortable command post in the rear. Rommel continued his lifelong practice of leading from the front. He would often be found in a command tank or an armored car right at the head of the column, directing traffic at a congested river crossing or urging his engineers forward. There is a quirky yet telling historical tidbit that perfectly captures his method. During the critical crossing of the Meuse River, his engineers were struggling to build a pontoon bridge under heavy French artillery fire. Men were faltering. Frustrated with the delay, Rommel went down to the riverbank himself. He waded into the water, physically helping to move the bridge sections into place, all while shells were exploding around him. His presence electrified his men. They saw a general who wasn't just giving orders, he was sharing their danger. He didn't rely on ponderous radio reports from the rear. He was a ghost in the sky as much as on the ground. He would take to the air in a small Fiesler-Storch observation plane, a fragile aircraft that let him see the battlefield with his own eyes. He would circle over a point of resistance, land in a nearby field, give a few sharp orders to a stunned junior officer, and then be airborne again before the dust settled. This was command at the speed of thought, a fluid, personal style that the rigid, hierarchical Allied command structure simply could not comprehend, let alone counter. His division's race across France was stunning. They shattered French divisions, captured tens of thousands of prisoners, and covered hundreds of miles in a matter of weeks. They were the first to reach the English Channel, cutting off the vast British and French armies in Belgium and sealing their fate, leading to the desperate evacuation at Dunkirk. To the German public, fueled by propaganda newsreels, Rommel became a national hero, the perfect image of the new, unstoppable German warrior. But behind the scenes, many in the German high command were not celebrating. They were horrified. They saw Rommel's tactics as reckless, a gamble of the highest order. His supply lines were stretched to the breaking point. His flanks were completely exposed. A well-organized, swift counterattack could have cut his division off and destroyed it completely. They believed he had been lucky, that his enemy had simply panicked and collapsed. They argued that such a reckless approach was unsustainable and would eventually lead to disaster. This leads to the great unresolved question of his French campaign. Was Rommel's success a product of pure military genius, a revolutionary understanding of modern warfare that no one else possessed? Or was he an incredibly skilled, incredibly charismatic gambler who rolled the dice and won big? Perhaps the truth is that Rommel understood something profound about this new era of war. He wasn't just fighting an army, he was fighting its nervous system. He calculated that the traditional, slow-moving command structure of the Allies was too rigid to cope with his speed. He gambled not on pure luck, but on his enemy's inability to think and react as quickly as he could. He was wagering that their bureaucracy would fail before his supply lines did. In France, that wager paid off spectacularly. But his next battlefield would be a far harsher and more unforgiving place, under a burning sun, in the vast and desolate sands of North Africa. The victory parades in Berlin were barely over when Rommel was summoned for a new, almost impossible task. His next destination was not the green fields of Europe, but a place that was the complete opposite, the vast, scorched emptiness of the North African desert. This was not a battlefield of Germany's choosing. It was a crisis. Germany's ally, Italy, had launched an ambitious invasion of British-held Egypt, hoping to seize the vital Suez Canal. The campaign had turned into an unmitigated disaster. The British Commonwealth forces had not just stopped the Italians, they had routed them, pushing them back over 800 miles and taking more than 100,000 prisoners in a stunningly successful campaign called Operation Compass. Mussolini's African dream was collapsing, and in his desperation he called on Hitler for help. Hitler, focused on his plans for invading the Soviet Union, saw the African theater as a sideshow, a distraction. He had no grand strategy for the desert. He simply needed to prevent a total Italian collapse, which would be a major embarrassment for the Axis powers. The man he chose for this rescue mission was the hero of the Ghost Division, Erwin Rommel. He was given a small, newly formed expeditionary force, the Deutsches Afrika Korps, and sent to Libya with the simple, clear order: hold the line. Defend what was left. Do not, under any circumstances, launch a major offensive with such a small force. In February of 1941, Rommel arrived in Tripoli. He found the Italian forces in a state of complete demoralization, ready to abandon North Africa entirely. The air was thick with defeat. But where his Italian allies saw despair, Rommel saw opportunity. The desert was not like the forests and towns of France. It was a vast, open ocean of sand, with no front lines, no trenches, no place to hide. It was a landscape made for the kind of war he excelled at, a war of movement, speed, and surprise. The rules were different here, and he understood that instinctively. He immediately began to defy his orders. The idea of sitting still, of digging in and waiting, was against every fiber of his being. He believed that in the desert, the defender was always at a disadvantage. The only way to survive was to attack, to keep the enemy off balance, to dictate the terms of the fight. And so, with only a fraction of his forces having arrived, he did what no one expected. He attacked. This immediate counterthrust is a mainstream historical fact that marks the beginning of his legend. He gathered what few German units he had, combined them with the shaken Italian divisions, and launched a lightning probe eastward. The British were completely caught by surprise. Their intelligence reports had told them the Germans were still arriving, that they were weak, and that they would be on the defensive for months. They had grown accustomed to the slow, predictable movements of the Italian army. They were not prepared for Rommel. He used feints and flanking maneuvers, sending his tanks on wide, sweeping arcs through the open desert to appear where they were least expected. He created a sense of overwhelming German strength that simply did not exist. And this is where a quirky and famous tidbit of his story comes in. To bolster this illusion of power, Rommel became a master of deception. He had workshops create dummy tanks, building wooden and canvas frames over simple Volkswagen cars. From a distance, especially through the shimmering desert heat haze, they looked like a formidable panzer force. He would drive these fake tanks around behind his lines, kicking up huge clouds of dust, making British aerial reconnaissance believe he had hundreds more tanks than he actually possessed. He was fighting a war of the mind as much as a war of machines. The British, confused by what they thought was a massive German army, and led by a commander who broke all the rules, began to fall back. Then they fell back further. Soon the retreat became a rout. In just a few weeks, Rommel's small force reversed all of the British gains, pushing them hundreds of miles back across the desert, all the way to the Egyptian border. He had not just followed his orders to stabilize the front, he had shattered them, and in doing so, transformed the entire strategic picture in North Africa. It was here that the British gave him his famous nickname, the Desert Fox. It was a name born of grudging respect for a cunning, unpredictable, and deadly opponent. But back in Berlin, the mood was not one of celebration. The German high command was furious. Rommel had ignored direct orders, launched an offensive with a force that was logistically unprepared for it, and had stretched his supply lines to a perilous length. He was winning, but in their eyes he was winning the wrong way, creating a commitment in a theater of war they considered unimportant. This brings us to the unresolved question that defined his entire African campaign. Was Rommel's brilliant audacity a form of military genius, or was it a form of strategic blindness? He understood the tactics of desert warfare better than anyone. He could win battles with a speed and elegance that no one else could match. But did he understand the bigger picture? Did he grasp that his victories were meaningless if he couldn't get the fuel, the ammunition, and the water needed to sustain them? By constantly pushing forward, by disobeying the cautious planners in Berlin, was he a maverick hero let down by his superiors, or was he an insubordinate gambler who was setting himself up for an inevitable fall? The legend of the Desert Fox was now forged, but the seeds of his ultimate defeat were being sown with every mile he advanced. The name Desert Fox was now spoken with a mix of fear and admiration in London, and with pride in Berlin. But the fox himself was beginning to starve. Rommel's stunning advance across hundreds of miles of desert had created a logistical nightmare. His supply lines were stretched thin, running all the way back to Tripoli, and every gallon of fuel, every bullet, every crate of food had to make a perilous journey across the Mediterranean Sea. And the Mediterranean was a sea controlled by the British Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force, operating from the tiny, unsinkable island fortress of Malta. Ship after ship carrying vital supplies for the Africa Corps was sent to the bottom of the sea. This constant gnawing shortage became the defining feature of Rommel's war. He might win a brilliant victory on Monday, only to find his tanks immobilized for lack of fuel on Tuesday. His predicament was symbolized by one major obstacle that stood in his way, the heavily fortified port of Tobruk. While he had swept past it in his initial dash, the fortress remained in Allied hands, a dagger pointed at his rear. It allowed the British to land supplies and reinforcements deep behind his lines, and he knew he could never truly be secure until it was taken. His first attempts to storm the fortress had been bloody failures, a harsh lesson that even his genius for mobile warfare had its limits against concrete and barbed wire. For months, the desert war swirled around Tobruk. The British launched offensives to relieve the siege. Rommel counterattacked to keep them at bay. The fighting was brutal and relentless, a war of attrition under a merciless sun. But by the late spring of 1942, Rommel felt he was ready to make his decisive move. He planned a complex and daring operation, swinging his panzer divisions in a wide arc around the southern flank of the British defensive line at Gazala, aiming to encircle them and finally take Tobruk from behind. The Battle of Gazala was Rommel at his best. It was a chaotic, swirling masterpiece of maneuver, where his forces were at times on the brink of annihilation, only to be saved by his personal intervention and his uncanny ability to read the flow of battle. After weeks of brutal fighting, he shattered the British armored divisions and trapped the Allied infantry. With the British army in full retreat, he turned his attention back to his ultimate prize. On the 20th of June 1942, Rommel launched his final assault on Tobruk. This is the mainstream historical fact that marks the zenith of his career. What had been an impregnable fortress for over a year fell in less than 24 hours. The surrender was a catastrophe for the Allies. Over 32,000 Allied soldiers were taken prisoner. A vast treasure trove of supplies, food, ammunition, and thousands of desperately needed vehicles fell into German hands. When the news reached Hitler, he was ecstatic. He immediately promoted Rommel to the rank of Field Marshal, the youngest in the German army. At that moment, Erwin Rommel was arguably the most famous general in the world. But victory hid a desperate reality. This brings us to a quirky yet revealing detail about the Africa Corps. They were masters of improvisation because they had no other choice. Rommel's army was so starved of German equipment that it became a patchwork of captured Allied gear. His men often preferred British trucks, which were far more reliable in the desert than their German counterparts. And critically, his panzer crews often discarded their own magnetic compasses. The metal hull of a tank could throw them off. a fatal error in a featureless desert. Instead, they relied on captured British sun compasses, simple but ingenious devices that used the sun's shadow to find true north. The greatest panzer general of his time was navigating the desert using his enemy's equipment. It was a perfect symbol of his campaign, tactical brilliance held together by shoestrings and scavenged parts. After the fall of Tobruk, Rommel stood at a crossroads. His army was exhausted, his tanks were worn out, but the path to Cairo and the Suez Canal, the ultimate prize, lay open. He pleaded with the German High Command for more men, more tanks, and above all, more fuel, arguing that one final push could win the war in North Africa. But Hitler's gaze was fixed elsewhere, on a city in Russia called Stalingrad. The Eastern Front was consuming everything. The African theater was, and always had been, a sideshow. Rommel's pleas were denied. He was told to make do with what he had. This brings us to the great unresolved question of the campaign. If Hitler had given Rommel the resources he asked for in that critical summer of 1942, could he have succeeded? If just a few of the divisions and air fleets being sent to the inferno at Stalingrad had been diverted to Africa, could the Desert Fox have reached the Suez Canal, changed the course of the war in the Mediterranean, and perhaps even the war itself? Or was he already doomed, a brilliant commander fighting an unwinnable war for a leadership that never truly valued his theater? We will never know. The field marshal, with his promotion in hand but his fuel tanks nearly empty, made the fateful decision to push on toward Egypt, toward a quiet railway stop on the coast, a place called El Alamein. The momentum that had carried Rommel across the desert from Tripoli to the gates of Egypt finally ran out. At El Alamein, the British, now under the new and determined command of General Bernard Montgomery, had prepared a formidable defensive line. Unlike the open desert, there were no flanks to turn here. The line was anchored by the sea in the north and the impassable Qattara Depression, a vast salt marsh in the south. For the first time, Rommel could not rely on maneuver. He had to punch straight through, and he no longer had the strength. The First Battle of El Alamein in July 1942 was a brutal, grinding fight that ended in a stalemate. But for Rommel, a stalemate was a defeat. His last, best chance to take Egypt was gone. Worn down by the relentless fighting and the desert climate, his health failing, Rommel was sent back to Germany to recover. It was during this leave that the British Eighth Army, massively reinforced with new American-made Sherman tanks and an overwhelming superiority in artillery and air power, was preparing to strike. On October 23, 1942, Montgomery launched Operation Lightfoot. 1,000 guns opened fire at once, and the Second Battle of El Alamein began. The situation for the Africa Corps was so desperate that Rommel was urgently summoned from his sickbed. He returned to a scene of utter devastation. His forces were outnumbered, outgunned, and critically, almost out of fuel. For days, he conducted a brilliant but hopeless defensive battle, shifting his few remaining panzer units from one crisis point to another. But he knew the line could not hold. He recognized that the only sane military decision was to withdraw, to save what was left of his magnificent army so they could fight another day. He sent a signal to Hitler's headquarters, requesting permission to retreat. The reply that came back was not a military order. It was a command born of delusion. Hitler ordered him to stand fast, to hold his ground to the last man. It was a sentence of death for the Africa Corps. This is the mainstream historical fact that marked the breaking point between Rommel and the leader he had once admired. For Rommel, this was a moment of profound crisis. To obey meant the senseless destruction of the men who had followed him with such loyalty. To disobey meant defying a direct order from the Führer, an act of treason. He hesitated for one crucial day, trying to obey, but the reality of the battlefield was overwhelming. Knowing he could not salvage the situation, he finally gave the order to retreat, saving the remnants of his army but sealing his fate with Hitler. The legend of the Desert Fox effectively ended in the sands of El Alamein. The long, fighting withdrawal back across Libya was a masterclass in delaying tactics, but the war in Africa was lost. Rommel was eventually recalled from Africa, a hero in the eyes of the public, but a man marked for his disobedience in the eyes of Hitler. He was given command of forces in France, tasked with building up the defenses of the Atlantic Wall against the expected Allied invasion. It was here that his disillusionment grew into something more dangerous. He saw that the war was lost, and that Hitler's increasingly irrational leadership was driving Germany into total ruin. This is where a more fringe, though compelling, detail emerges. It is believed by some historians that Rommel, in his final months, was quietly reaching out to Allied contacts through intermediaries in Switzerland, hoping to negotiate a separate peace on the Western Front to save Germany from the Soviets advancing from the east. Whether this was a serious plot or just a desperate thought, it shows how far he had traveled from the loyal general of 1940. His open criticism of Hitler's strategy and his growing despair brought him to the attention of a group of high-ranking German officers who were planning to remove Hitler from power. Rommel agreed that Hitler had to be removed, but he did not support assassination. He believed Hitler should be arrested and put on trial before the German people. He was a soldier, not a conspirator, but he had crossed a dangerous line. This leads to the tragic, unresolved question of his final days. How deeply was Rommel truly involved in the July 20th plot to kill Hitler? The plot failed when the bomb placed in Hitler's headquarters only wounded him. In the brutal purge that followed, anyone remotely connected to the conspiracy was rounded up. Under torture, one of the conspirators mentioned Rommel's name, claiming the famous field marshal was on their side. The phrase, "Tell those in Berlin they can rely on me," was used as evidence against him. But was this a true reflection of his commitment, or was it the desperate words of a man trying to lend weight to the cause? Was Rommel a central figure, a willing participant in the plot to overthrow the government? Or was he a sympathetic patriot on the fringes, whose famous name was used by the conspirators without his full consent? The truth no longer mattered to Hitler. Rommel's fame was too great for a public trial, which would have shattered morale on the home front. So, a quieter solution was found. On October 14, 1944, two of Hitler's generals arrived at Rommel's home. They presented him with the choice: face a humiliating public trial for treason, which would result in his execution and the persecution of his family, or take his own life quietly. If he chose the latter, he would be given a state funeral with full military honors, and his family would be protected and receive his pension. To save his wife and son, he made his choice. He said a calm goodbye, got into the car with the generals, and was driven down a quiet country lane. A few minutes later, he was dead, a victim of a cyanide capsule. The official story given to the German people was that the great Field Marshal Rommel had died from complications from wounds he had received earlier in an air attack. The epic of the Desert Fox ended not in the heat of battle, but in a quiet, forced betrayal. His story leaves us with the enduring question of what it means to be a good soldier in a bad war, a patriot serving a criminal regime. He was a man of honor, trapped by his own sense of duty, in a history that would show no mercy. Erwin Rommel's life is a story of contradictions. He was a brilliant innovator of war, yet he was known for his humanity and chivalry on the battlefield. His soldiers of the Afrika Korps were famously never accused of the terrible war crimes that stained the reputation of other German units. He treated prisoners well and was respected, even admired, by his opponents, including Winston Churchill himself. He was a devoted family man who wrote to his wife Lucy almost every day from the battlefield. Yet, this decent man lent his genius and his loyalty to one of the most monstrous regimes in human history. Did his sense of duty blind him to the evil he was serving? Or did he, like so many others, believe he could separate the soldier from the state, serving his country while ignoring its crimes? His journey from Hitler's favorite general to a man forced to die by his command is a timeless and tragic lesson. It reminds us that the lines between patriotism and complicity, between duty and morality, can sometimes become blurred, especially in the fog of war. The legend of the Desert Fox endures not just because of his victories, but because his story forces us to ask difficult questions about honor, loyalty, and the choices we make when faced with an impossible situation. Thank you for spending part of your day with us. If this story left you thinking, we hope you'll join us again.